Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank you for the invitation. It's really nice to be here for the second time at this very interesting conference. I have a little bit difficult task right now. First of all, I chose quite a difficult topic to discuss today. And secondly, I know that we might be a little bit tired after the whole day of discussing architecture. But I would like to promise to keep my time, and I hope that I will keep you awake. The title of my presentation and the inspiration for the title, Durability and Fleetingness of Architecture at the example of cross-border town Cieszyn. The inspiration to this title comes from a conference which was held last autumn in Krakow, where we discussed durability and fleetingness of architecture in many contexts. And the second inspiration is the ongoing research which we are doing together with colleagues from this department about the cross-border parts of our region, Upper Silesia. Since we are discussing Upper Silesia, I would like to start with a citation from a Polish film director, Kazimierz Kuc. He describes Upper Silesia, the fifth side of the world. It's a place where borders disappear, where history plays with people and nations. It's neither possible to enclose it in a rigid frame, nor to describe from the beginning to the end. One can only try to discover it piece by piece, compile it from thousands of funny, mysterious and fascinating people's stories. And I do believe that this is a very good description, and right now I would like to concentrate on a very little part of this region. Since I would like to discuss the second half of the century, so-called modernistic architecture, I think it's good to start with trying to define what the architecture of cross-border city is. How do we understand that? And Aldo Rossi, with his classic book, Architecture of the City, arrives with a very interesting citation. And he says that architecture is one of the most important elements constructing landscape of every town and city. In cross-border towns, architecture should be understood not only as the visible image of the town and as the sum of different architectures, but architecture as construction, the construction of the city over time. And a very important thing is stressed here, that which is the time factor. So the landscape of every city and town, but with a special attention of cross-border cities and towns, is construction within the time. And this time factor is, in my opinion, a very important element when we discuss the architecture of the cross-border town. What is a border? Border, as we all know, creates a certain dynamic. This dynamic can be both positive but also, in many cases, also negative. When we look into the literature about borders, we find many definitions what a border is, and I would like to pay your attention to some of those. We have, of course, natural and non-natural borders. We have, as described, good borders, which are created naturally by important landscape elements like hills, seas, deserts. But we have so-called bad borders, political ones, created mostly in turbulent times of the first half of the 20th century, which is giving us the discussion of us and others, those so-called bad borders. The border between Poland and Czech Republic is, by some of the researchers, described as so-called hard border because it's hampered by difficult history, which makes difficult to build trust between cooperating actors. When we look at the history of Cieszyn, which is right now rather small or medium-sized town just at the border, actually there are two towns, Polish Cieszyn and Czech Cieszyn. The history of that town is rooted in 10th century. As the legend describes, the city was erected by three brothers, three sons of Polish duke, who met after the long separation, and since they were happy because of this meeting, they created a city called Cieszyn. But what is interesting for us is that Cieszyn and its landscape, this urban landscape, was influenced by many cultures, many religions, many nations, to mention only the Czech people, Polish people, German, Jews, by many years from the very beginning of that town. When we look at diagrams showing the city structure of the town, we can easily identify that industrialization period, which started for Cieszyn in 1948, came with significant changes for the town, especially on the left bank of this town. First of all, the railway line, which was built in the second half of 19th century, which is that blue line here, which helped to develop new industries on the left bank of the city, which also helped to build the new housing facilities, and also other modern transport infrastructure like the tram, which used to start close to the main market, pass by the river, and link the existing historic part of the city with the also built at that time modern railway station. A lot of previously located outside of the city smaller settlements were also included into the city. But then came the year 1920. Those dates which you see here are dates of the historical maps I could find on a local library. So they also it was help for me to make those analyses. But in the year 1920, the city was divided the town was divided into two towns. So from that time we have Polish and Czech Cieszyn. And right now we see that the biggest development starts on the left bank. So somehow the city on the left bank, the Czech Cieszyn, is created, we could say, from the scratch. But what's interesting for us and what makes the case study interesting and on the other hand difficult is that from that time the so-called proper dialogue with Cieszyn inhabitants was made much more difficult, and the trust between people became a questionable issue. And over the years, both towns were developing, as we still see the left bank of the town is developing much more intensively. And then comes the times which are interesting for us, which is the second half of the 20th century. And we can identify a big housing, the big dwelling settlements on both sides of the river. So also on the left bank you see two biggest groups of those housing settlements, but also on the right bank side you also see those here. But what is even more maybe interesting is the architecture, the industrial architecture, which is somehow underlining the border between the two parts of the city. I'm going to come back to that architecture in a few moments. Let's take a look how does it look in a landscape around. We see osiedle Świdwice, we see osiedle ONV, osiedle Grabińsko, osiedle Mojsko on the left bank. On the right bank we see osiedle Winograd, Liburnia, Piastowska, Zachód, osiedle Pogórze. And also we could easily notify the industrial architecture, which, as I mentioned, in some ways is underlining the city division because it's so close to the border. This white line shows the high-speed road, which was created a little bit later. Another look at the landscape on the left bank of the city. And right now, let's take a look on the changes in landscape. How does the urban landscape, so-called built landscape of the city, was changing in the second half of the 20th century. Świdwice estate, it's not very well visible, but it's far out of the let's say historical part of the left bank city. We also see Mojska and Grabińska estates on the left bank. Freisztackie przedmieście on the right bank of the city. You see the character of the location, which is not very intensive in an urban structure, and then comes all those intensively built structures in the 70s and 80s. Freisztackie przedmieście in Winograd, we see two of those, and Pogórze estate, which is very specific housing settlements in Cieszyn because it's very much outside of the city structure. You will notify it on this small hill in a moment. You see it here. So also you can see how the relation between the existing urban fabric coming or rooted in the 19th and the beginning of 20th century was changed dramatically with those heavy intervention made in the second half of the 20th century. But not only those big housing estates is a kind of a, I don't know if it's we can describe that as a problem, as an issue in the urban fabric of Cieszyn, but also changing the way people move, the people commute in the city. The modern infrastructure which was built, which I mentioned at the beginning of 20th century, was unfortunately removed. So the tram line doesn't exist anymore in Cieszyn. And we can easily see how does the shape, how does the image of the streets change. How much space for cars we have right now in Cieszyn. It's not. It's almost the central street. It's almost the central location. This photograph, VŠB Street, and how little space we have for pedestrians. Another modern infrastructure on that time, which was the underway path under the railways, built also between 19th and 20th century. We see it as quite a lively place on that time. And this is a photograph taken 2 weeks ago, and in the middle of the day, and it looks a little bit abandoned. When we think about modern planning or modern thinking about the city, which is most important for me right now while discussing Cieszyn, we could come to some criticism made in 70s or 80s in the international literature about modern planning of cities. And I would like to concentrate on Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs argues about the city diversity as important factor of its sustainable development. And she identifies 4 main generators of so-called city diversity. The need for mixed primary uses, the need for small city blocks, the need for aged buildings, and the need for concentration. Some of those, or I would say all of those housing estates and some examples I showed you, there are only a few examples from the city, could be quite easily criticized among those elements. But of course the open question is, how do we want to plan the city right now if we know that the modern way of thinking about the city has some failures? I think that holistic understanding of a built landscape, of an urban landscape, could be a kind of a proposal and could be a kind of a solution. Urban landscape should be understood as a mosaic of many physical elements, but also events and stories, like those stories Kazimierz Kuc mentioned. Complete image of this mosaic have to be achieved in a partner open discussion. Not only big urban project, but also architecture rooted in the second half of 20th century could also play a very important role in this dialogue between two parts of the city right now. And I think that modernistic architecture can also help to establish a new image of the town. Its landscape can be and frequently is promoted as one shaped by specific cross-border encounters. And I think that this Cieszyn Divadlo, this Cieszyn theater is probably one of the best examples of how those encounters, those cultural encounters can play a very good role in the discussion about the city future. We also have cross-border border crossing facilities which stand just at the border, and I'm showing only one example of those objects. on a Polish side, very close to Piast, historical Piast castle. And since some years and months, it's a discussion in a Polish town whether we should tear down this building and replace that with a new facility for offices and serving to the city as a kind of an incubator. So right now it's quite obvious that the location in the city, the plot in the city, is much more valuable than the architecture itself. And I promised you to go back to this industrial architecture, which is somehow underlining the border, the division between those two cities. Right now we see Freedom Bridge and Strzelnicza Street. The photograph was taken again between the 19th and 20th century. We see the left bank, industrializing left bank of the city, which is right now Czeski Cieszyn, and the border goes approximately on this line. And this is again a photograph taken something like 2 weeks ago. We see industrial buildings which are still functioning, even if the industry is not that much important right now, for at least for the Polish Cieszyn, Polish part of the town. But the open question is whether if the city wouldn't be divided, if this industrial architecture would develop that intensively in this specific location. It was developed very intensively in this location from 1960s. One of the latest books about Cieszyn history, published in 2 years ago, I found quite an interesting citation again about architecture rooted in the second half of the 20th century. And Mrs. Kwaśny says that projects in this period, prepared mostly by nameless architects working in offices, are not distinguished by anything in particular, as well as through the country. It's difficult to assign specific blocks to a particular architects, and assigning those objects as architectural style would be a great abuse. Despite this, the creation of regulation plans for Cieszyn, the town is not modernized, retaining its original historic structure, and the old town, despite the facade renovation, is still not a living city. I think this is especially this sentence about the architectural style is quite a sad, especially for those people really working with this architecture. But this is, I think, showing us in a very precise way what is the climate currently, at least in Polish Cieszyn, about the second half of 20th century modern architecture. What could be the scenarios for the future for this town? It's a very difficult and open question, and I do not feel to answer it today. But I would like to stress a few things. First of all, is the understanding of the urban landscape of the two twin towns. It should be, in my opinion, the basis for any discussion about the future of this town and also about the future of cross-border regions. Again, a citation from Jane Jacobs: the city is not a static creation, but it's a subject to continuous dynamic changes, and the elements forming it, including architecture, change their relationship. So again, the time factor, and again, that we do not have a static situation. It's changing all the time. Second thing, how and if the second half of 20th century modern architecture could fit into the identity of Czech and Polish Cieszyn citizens. I think this could be quite difficult when we keep in our mind this citation from Ms. Kwaśny describing how do people feel about the modern architecture created and built in the second half of the second century. This could be difficult. But on the other hand, I would like to stress that adaptation and acceptation by local citizens of this architecture is, in my opinion, much more important than the aesthetical issues of modern architecture. And the last thing, does Cieszyn and Czech Cieszyn wants to be again one real town? Common vision could be achieved only in a dialogue. Of course, a lot of obstacles we could easily identify in that process, coming from historical obstacles, emotional obstacles, economical obstacles, administrative obstacles. But I think that it's good to pay attention on such a projects which are going on in Europe. To take the first example of Öresund city, which is currently created between Malmö and Copenhagen. The city which is having, of course, a very different location because it's divided with a sea. But it has some, at least, similar problems with its development. Just to conclude, constructing cross-border towns is an open process. How and if the twin towns wants to overcome the existing scarf in its landscape, and what are the possibility scenarios for the process? This is an open question, and we are looking forward to continue the research on that. How to end out of the typical for second half of the 20th century planning in the black box and start dialogue between local citizens about the shape of the town. How to encourage citizens to pay attention to their landscape, to their towns. How to encourage maybe students, maybe schoolboys, pupils, younger generations to start this dialogue and to combine the message, to combine information, and to help to create a complete image of such a town or region. Cross-border towns sometimes seems to be more than a concept than a really existing thing. It's many examples of literature. When we read about that kind of places, it's quite a common statement that sometimes we have a vision, we have a dream of having a cross-border town or having a cross-border city, but it's in many cases is still a dream. Trust, time and dialogue, it's those elements which I think are important. Anyway, I would like to say that we are in a kind of a starting phase of this discussion. And we are working, researching, designing intensively, but as we all know, it's a project for the next generations. Thank you very much.